Welcome to the Haunted Brew. Grab your favorite blend of coffee or tea and pull up a comfy chair for some unexplainable and unsettling stories. Ones that may leave you intrigued or sleeping with the light on tonight. While we were prepping the wood-cutting area, removing fallen branches, fueling the chainsaw, clearing a trail to the truck, and other various tasks, our dog Sadie was dutifully beside Alex while she scouted an area across the road. I continued limbing tree trunks and dragging branches into a pile. When Alex returned, she began pulling on a pair of Kevlar chaps and Sadie trotted over to make sure I was piling the branches properly. A few minutes later, I heard a strange sound. Sadie heard it too because her ears perked up and she was transfixed on something deeper in the forest. The noise sounded like a small child giggling. It wasn't a delightful childish glee sort of laugh, it was actually quite unnerving. Even more so because we were at the end of a remote and very unkempt road. The road narrows with pine trees seemingly swallowing it the deeper you go. It ends at a sloping meadow that drops into a steep, mountainous valley. No one was behind us and no one was ahead. We were alone on the mountain. Alex saw me standing there, looking in the same direction as Sadie. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" I told her it was probably nothing. Only because I didn't want her to roll her eyes thinking I was trying to fabricate a story to tell. We continued working for roughly an hour before taking a lunch break. In case you're wondering, turkey sandwiches, cantaloupe and iced tea, beef jerky and water for Sadie. All the wood was cut and loaded. We just needed to get the saw and gear into the back of the truck. It wasn't until we slowly ambled our way back toward the small mountain town that I mentioned what I heard to Alex. "I heard something strange coming from that tree line. Whatever it was, Sadie heard it too." Before I could give any additional details, Alex said, "Did you hear a small child laughing?" "You heard it too?" I asked. Alex said she heard it when she was scouting across the road. She said it sounded like it originated from the patch of forest beside the meadow. I then put two and two together and realized we both heard the strange vocalization in completely opposite directions, almost as if something was circling us. We agreed that the childlike giggle didn't sound quite right. Something was off about it. It was almost as if an adult were trying to mimic the sounds of a playful child. Even though it was broad daylight and we were in a moving truck, there was still a sense of vulnerability in the air. Bumping over rocks and ruts, occasionally braking for crossing wildlife, we rolled our windows down and let the summer smoky wind blow through the cab of the truck. When we were still up in the dense pines, however, I couldn't help but notice we each had only rolled our windows down far enough to let fresh air in and allow ground breeze out. Maybe Sasquatch Chronicles isn't the best podcast when woodcutting in the remote regions of the mountains. We moved from California to Oklahoma in the summer of 1980, so my husband could attend the little-known but well-funded pharmacy school. The small town we lived in was geared toward all things university, and we thought raising our 3 girls in such an atmosphere would be a very good thing. Unfortunately, it was the height of a short-lived oil boom, and between the returning college students and the influx of oil field workers, housing was in very short supply. With only 3 days left on the U-Haul rental, and money and optimism dwindling fast, we got out the atlas to look at the surrounding rural farm towns, hoping to see if we might find the odd or even abandoned farmhouse that somebody might rent to us at a reduced rate in exchange for fixing it up. Fortunately, gas prices were pretty low because we spent hours driving with the kids around the countryside, stopping in rural diners, post offices, gas stations, and general stores in hopes of finding someone willing to rent to an out-of-state college student, his wife, and 3 kids. A tall order. Just before sunset, we stopped at a little country store to get something for the kids and to let them take a break from sitting so long in the car. The woman behind the counter, while not overly friendly, listened to me while I told her our problem and directed me 2 miles down the road to an elderly farming couple that still had their original farmhouse, still sitting empty on acreage near a creek. It was lonely, fairly isolated, and in serious need of a good cleaning, but a godsend. The house was a small, white, poorly insulated 1930s single-story with 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a basement, and an added-on room that must have served as a workroom or a laundry room, which we used as a playroom for the kids until the weather got too cold. The wide front porch faced east. The house set quite a ways back off the road and had a large, unpaved, circular driveway lined with several large jack elm trees. Out behind the house were 2 barns, a pump house, and an old wooden single-car garage that leaned a little to the north. This part of the farm sat at the bottom of a long, steep grade, surrounded by fields and across from a little creek, the length of which was shielded from the road by a thick stand of brush and sumac. There were several stands of woods and creeks in the area, and very few farmhouses, the closest being maybe half a mile away. I guess all this detail is necessary to help set the scene for my story. It was at the end of summer, but not yet chilly. The wheat around our place had been harvested and the straw baled and hauled off. The winter wheat, not having been planted yet, left the field standing in stubble. My husband had been studying all day for a test, and the girls had long been tucked into bed. Before he declared himself finished for the day, it must have been around 11 o'clock. It was always his habit to go for a walk before bed when he had been at the books for several hours. His path would take him down the driveway to the paved road, turning north to continue along the wheat field to the section road, then west past the remnants of an old farmhouse with a barely standing windmill, to a bridge that crossed another creek, and then back to the house the same way he came. The whole round trip would have been a little less than 2 miles. He'd walked it so often I think he could have found the way in his sleep, and he never bothered to take a flashlight, never felt the need. Even on a moonless night, the country dark was such that your eyes became accustomed to it, and starlight was adequate to provide enough contrast between the light and dark shapes along the road. When Gus got ready to leave, I turned the television on low to watch the news while I waited for him to return. The front door lock was a cranky, ancient thing that took a skeleton key and was sometimes difficult to open, but my husband always insisted I lock the door while he was gone. I'm not sure how much time passed since he had left or if I had even dozed off for a bit, but I was gradually aware of something that made me uneasy. It was a sound approaching the front porch, a pounding sound that I realized I'd been hearing for several seconds. Suddenly, it flew onto the porch, and there was Gus, banging on the door and yelling for me to let him in, quick. I fumbled with that stupid key, finally getting it to turn, and he burst through the door, slammed it shut, locking it, and then, holding his breath, he listened. I couldn't even speak. All I could do was stare at the door as if our 4 eyes together would be a much stronger defense against whatever was on the other side. It seemed like several minutes passed before either of us moved. Gus slowly drew the shade back to peek out the front window, waving away my insistent whispered questions. They would have to wait as he went from room to room, checking and locking windows and doors, turning on the back porch light and scanning the yard. When he was satisfied that all was secure and nothing seemed to be moving outside, we sat facing each other on the couch, my apprehension growing every minute. I remember looking over his shoulder, through the kitchen and into the room beyond, wishing I'd bought drapes for all those windows and wondering why I had chosen the little cafe curtains that would let in so much light during the daytime, but didn't keep out nearly enough of the night. Gus told me it had started just like any other of his late night walks. He was too wound up to sleep, and the exercise would tire him just enough to get a good night's rest. There was no moon, no wind, and it was one of those nights that seemed to carry even the smallest sounds for a great distance. He said it made you want to walk as silently as you could, your footsteps sounding too loud in your own ears. He passed under the jack elms to the paved road, turned north, and walked along the barbed wire fence separating the field from the pavement. The entire field is completely fenced, except for small breaks at the corners, just large enough for a man to pass through to check the field without having to climb over the wire. The night was perfectly still as he came to the section break, stopped to look at the silhouette of the old house set back from the road, and turned west, walking next to the fence, until something caught his eye. In the middle of the field was a dark, mounded shape against the lighter background of the stubble. He said he assumed it must have been a boulder, but it seemed odd that he hadn't noticed it before, and it didn't seem likely the farmer would have left such a large obstacle in the field that was harvested by combines. Not giving it any further thought, he turned to continue his walk, but was brought up short when it seemed that the boulder had shifted, just a little. Realizing he was tired and he couldn't be 100% certain of anything he was seeing in the darkness, he stood where he was, straining his eyes to get a better look. Nearly a minute passed when he saw it again. This time he was sure this quote-unquote boulder had moved, like a crouching man shifting carefully from foot to foot, getting ready to run. Not trusting what his eyes were telling him, but no longer interested in finishing his walk, he turned and began a brisk pace back to the house, keeping his eye on the shape. He could barely believe it when it began to move stealthily toward the fence. Gus said at that point, he broke into a jog, eye on the field, his mind quickly going over a list of all the animals he knew were native to our area. It could be a wild boar or a cougar, or even one of those so-called buffalo wolves. Wouldn't want to confront any of them weaponless late at night. And what was the matter with him anyway? Why had he left the house without so much as a flashlight that he could use as a defensive weapon? And then, whatever this thing was, it did something a wild animal shouldn't have done, wouldn't have done. It anticipated his path. Instead of running along the fence or trying to jump over it to chase him, it stood up slightly and cut diagonally across the open field, heading for the corner fence break that he would have to pass in order to reach home. It was trying to cut him off. What kind of animal would do that? At this point, his head was thrown back, his arms were pumping, feet pounding the ground, not daring to look back. He said if he'd had enough breath, he'd have started shouting for me to open the door before he got anywhere near the house, and thought that at any second, he'd feel tooth and claw land on the back of his neck as I struggled with the door to let him in. It was his feet hitting the driveway that had first alerted me. I don't think either one of us slept that night. This experience had us spooked for quite a while. Never did find out what it was, and never saw anything like it again. Although the kids came running up to the house from one of the barns one day, all excited about the scary black thing they saw in the field. I don't think we had told them the story of that night yet, and I always wondered if they had actually seen something. Maybe they did. I know that whenever we went anywhere, I always tried to make sure we arrived home early, had all the animals gathered in, doors locked, and curtains drawn well before dark.